everyone. In this video, we are going to discuss about hydrophily. In some of the books, you might find that hydrophily is written as hydrogamy. So hydrophily and hydrogamy both are same. Okay. We have discussed about the process of pollination in previous videos, and there we have learned that pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther of the flower to the stigma of the flower. Okay. Now for this process of transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma, there are different agents which help the plant. So one of the agent is wind, about which we have already discussed in the previous video. And now in this video, we are going to discuss about the second agent, which is called water. So in this term here, hydro means water. Okay. So hydrogamy or hydrophily is actually the process of pollination in plants by or with the help of water, right? Now this hydrogamy or hydrophily is of two types, hypohydrogamy, and the second type is epihydrogamy. Hypohydrogamy or epihydrogamy, okay? The names are given because in some of the water plants, this process of pollination occurs beneath the water surface. That means under the water, okay? And in some of the water plants, this process of pollination occurs on the surface of water, right? So hypohydrogamy, okay, hypo, this term hypo means under or beneath, okay? So hypohydrogamy is actually the type of hydrogamy in which pollination occurs beneath the water surface, okay? The process of pollination, that means and pollen grains will transfer from anther to stigma inside the water, under the water surface, okay? And the pollen grains in such plants are obviously, these are waterborne. And the example is Jostera marina, Ceratophyllum, etc. Okay. So this Jostera marina is actually having the longest pollen grain. This we have already discussed in the previous video. Jostera marina, also known as sea grass, is having the longest pollen grain. Okay. And this particular pollen grain does not have exine. Okay. Exine is a very strong, a very tough covering present around the pollen grain, and it is made up of a substance. It is actually made up of a biopolymer called sporopollenin. Okay, it is made up of a biopolymer called sporopollenin, right? So this exine actually protects this pollen grain under unfavorable conditions. So this exine is absent in Jostera marina pollen grains. Now, for example, this is the surface of the ocean or water, okay, and this is actually, the ground or the bottom surface. This is on the top is water surface. Now, what happens is this Jostera marina, you can see in the picture as it is visible, it's actually completely rooted plants. That means the roots are actually, anchored in the soil at the at the bottom of the sea, okay? And then this Jostera marina is there, okay? The plant is there. For example, this is the male flower, okay? This is the male flower, and here you have female flower. Okay, here you have female flower. Now, this male flower, the anthers of male flower, they will produce pollen grains. The pollen grains of Jostera marina, okay, the pollen grains of Jostera marina are, long, very longest pollen grain. The size is around 2500 micrometer. Okay, they are long and needle shaped. Okay, so how is the pollen grain? Long and needle shaped. Okay. Now one point to be noted here is, if this pollen grain will be lighter than the water, so what will happen? This pollen grain will move up and it will float on the surface of water. If this pollen grain is heavier than the water, so obviously the pollen grain will go down and sink at the bottom. But this pollen grain is actually of the size or it is actually having a density which is almost equal to that of water. Otherwise, that's the reason this pollen grain is actually able to move inside the water. So this needle-shaped pollen grain move along with the water current, comes and sit on the stigma of this flower. So this is how pollination occurs in Jostera marina. Now let's see about the process of pollination in Ceratophyllum. This is a typical Ceratophyllum plant. The complete name is Ceratophyllum demersum. Okay, and this plant, or the model of this plant is actually also used in the artificial ecosystem of aquarium. Okay, I'm talking about the artificial aquarium. Okay, so here you can see these are actually the male flower, and it also has anthers. Okay, these are actually this is actually the male flower, and this one is female flower. Okay. Now in Ceratophyllum demersum, what happens is, for example, this is the ground surface of the sea, okay, and this is water surface. Here you have water surface. Now this Ceratophyllum is also a rooted plant, okay. For example, this is the male flower, okay, and this is the female flower. This is female flower, and this one is the male flower. Okay, in actual the flowers do not look like this. This is only for understanding the process. Now what happens in Ceratophyllum demersum is, once these flowers are completely mature, okay, when this female and male flower, they're completely mature, the anthers from the male flower get detached from the flower and floats on the surface of water. So here what will happen? Okay, these anthers, they're lighter in weight. Okay, these anthers will move up. Okay, they will detach from the flower, and then they will start floating on the surface of water. Okay, so these are anthers floating on the surface of water. Okay, and these anthers, they undergo dehiscence. Okay, dehiscence means these anthers, they split in order to release pollen grains. Okay, so these anthers, they undergo dehiscence, okay, and then they release pollen grains, right? So these are pollen grains. Okay, now these pollen grains, they germinate on the surface of water. Okay, so these pollen grains, they germinate on they actually germinate on the surface of water. Okay, and after they germinate on the surface of water, they sink down inside the water and move to the female flower, and finally sit on the stigma. Okay, so in Ceratophyllum demersum, the anthers, they detach from the flower and float on the surface of water. Anthers, they undergo dehiscence also on the surface of water. Pollen grains germinate also on the surface of water, and then they move down, they sink down with the growing pollen tube, and sits on the stigma, and finally fertilizes the eggs. So this was all about hypohydrogamy. That means when this process of pollination occurs inside the water. Okay. Now the next type of hydrophily or hydrogamy is epihydrogamy. So epi means on the surface, okay, or you can say outer covering. Okay, so the meaning of term epi is on the surface. Now this type of pollination occurs on the surface of water. Okay, and the best example is Vallisneria. Now in case of Vallisneria, what happens is the male and female flower, they both are present on the same plant. Okay, now for example, this is actually the river bed. Okay, now what happens is, this is the water surface. Now this Vallisneria is growing here. Okay, this Vallisneria is again the rooted plant, and it is completely submerged plant, and this is growing in the water freely. Okay. Now here in Vallisneria, the male flowers are actually present in clusters. Okay. So for example, these are actually the clusters of male flower. Okay, this is the cluster of male flower. Okay, and this cluster of male flower is known as spadix. And here we also have the normal female flower. Okay, we also have the normal female flower. But one point to be noted here is, the stalk of the female flower is actually highly coiled, and then arises the female flower like this. The stalk of the female flower is highly coiled, and then arises the flower. Okay. Now what happens is when these flowers mature, the male flowers especially, they actually detach from the spadix. Okay, they detach and move up. Okay, move up to the surface of water. Now this male flower is having three tepals. One tepal is like, two tepals of this male flower are present under the water or on the surface of water, and one flower is actually, one tepal of this flower is actually is up. Okay, and this particular tepal of the flower helps in the floating of this male flower on the surface of water. Now this male flower is also having stamens, okay, like this. So these stamens, they actually, are having anther, and anthers, they dehiscence. They undergo the process of dehiscence and they release pollen grains. Now these pollen grains actually now float on the surface of water. Meanwhile, what happens is when these anthers release pollen, immediately here this coiled part of the female flower, okay, this coiled stalk of the female flower will uncoil. Okay, it will uncoil and stretch and increase in the height. Okay, it will increase in the length so that female flower can reach to the surface of water. Okay, and now these pollen grains can easily come and pollinate the stigma. Okay, they can sit on the stigma. Okay, and once the pollination process completes, okay, once the pollination process takes place, it completes, the female flower will now again, it will come down, okay, and the stalk of the female flower will sink. Okay, so this was all about hydrophily. In next video, we are going to discuss about entomophily. That means process of pollination in which the agents are insects.